Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find our friends at Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. Why did the New York Stock Exchange suspend trading without warning on July 8, 2015? Why did certain Toyota vehicles accelerate uncontrollably against the will of the drivers? Why does programming inside our airplanes occasionally surprise its creators? After a thorough analysis by top experts, the answers still elude us. We don't understand the software running our cars or our iPhones or our smartphones, but here's a secret. Neither do the geniuses at Apple or the PhDs at Toyota. Well, not perfectly anyway. No one, not lawyers, doctors, accountants, or policymakers, fully grasps the rules governing our tax returns, our retirement accounts, and our hospital medical machinery. The same technology advances that have simplified our lives have made the systems governing our lives incomprehensible, unpredictable, and overcomplicated. Today's guest offers us fresh, insightful field guide to living with complex technologies that defy human comprehension. It is a pleasure to welcome back the author of Overcomplicated, Technology at the Limits of Comprehension, Samuel Arbesman. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you back, man. I have the Arbesman tome behind me there. You can see 2 books on the shelf behind me. We've covered The Half-Life of Facts. Brilliant episode. Great feedback on that, Samuel. And also, this is up next and followed by his latest book, The Magic of Code, next week. Sam, I thought we'd start with your overview of the book. So for those people who go TLDL, too long didn't listen, what's the main point from the book, Overcomplicated?
Yeah, so the main point is that when we think about technologies, obviously our technologies have gotten more and more complex over time, more and more interconnected. And I feel like each of us recognize this. We're like, we don't understand how our phones work or how various other technologies work. But the truth is, it's that issue of not understanding these technologies, it's not just for the users. It is increasingly for the people who actually built these systems, or even just work with them and the experts who work with them on a daily basis, that these technologies are increasingly incomprehensible due to the accretion over time, the kind of interconnection of all the different systems together, yielding all these unanticipated consequences. And so we are increasingly getting into this realm of incomprehensible technologies.
I thought about how you must have had a moment, you know, that character from The Simpsons that goes, ha ha, that guy, where when COVID hit, we saw the resilience and the complexity of so many of our systems and the lack of resilience of those systems as well. And you wrote it before the COVID pandemic, which I thought was an interesting one. But I mentioned in the intro those 3 instances. I thought we better cover those because people will be kind of going, well, what were they about? I don't quite remember what happened in the stock exchange in 2015, for example.
Yeah, so this was, so back, I guess now 20 years ago, the stock exchange had an issue where I think like certain parts of it went down. It was actually interesting where I think the New York Stock Exchange went down alongside a number of other computational systems, like right around the same time. And people actually thought initially that this was just some sort of coordinated attack where it was like some sort of cyber attack. And then it turns out upon further examination, it wasn't. It was just buggy code. And it happened to be that like when you have enough bugs and large technologies, eventually you'll have things that simultaneously go down. And so, yeah, it was one of those instances, and I don't remember the exact details, but it was one of these things where I think there was this simultaneous failure, which is kind of crazy to see.
And the other one was the Toyota car, and Toyota, they're a client of mine. They're going to hate me for bringing this up, but it's quite interesting. I find it quite interesting that even these companies that we laud as great innovators become susceptible to this, particularly as we move more and more towards code. And we kind of see code as a science, but as you show in the book, it's more akin to complexity and biology at times.
Yeah. So, I mean, right, when we think of cars, we think, oh, like it's this big piece of machinery, and it's big and complex, but it's also increasingly just a huge computer program on wheels. Like these are computers on wheels. Like they have, I think, depending on the situation, like they can be like tens of millions of lines of computer code which is often used as a rough proxy for complexity of code. Which means, of course, when you have that amount of computer code, it is very difficult for any single human to keep it all in their head. And so what happened with Toyota vehicles, this is back in, I think, like maybe 2008 timeframe, if I remember correctly, that people noticed that occasionally certain Toyota vehicles would accelerate unexpectedly. This is called unanticipated acceleration. And then occasionally, when these cars would just accelerate uncontrollably, they would crash. And in certain cases, actually, people died. It was actually a really serious issue. And so there was a court case to try to understand what was going on. And it was one of these situations where, from what I understand, it wasn't like you could point to a single line of code of this kind of thing is actually the reason for the failure. It was rather that when the system reaches this level of complexity, in this case, it sounds like they actually built the system in such a way that they did not actually adhere to certain, I guess, responsible kind of coding practices. But it was a situation where when you build something that big and don't necessarily do it as well as you could have, the incomprehensibility of these technologies is almost inevitable. And so it wasn't like, you could point to this was the reason for the failure or some other kind of thing. It was just when you have a system this large, that's the inevitable result. And I think this kind of speaks to also just more broadly how we think about failure in systems. We want to there's this deep-seated human desire to say, okay, here's the reason for the failure. Here's the person that did something wrong. And sometimes we can actually do that. But as these systems become bigger and bigger, we often can't do that. It's an accumulation of a lot of different decisions and the accumulation of the increasing complexity of the system, whether it's software, it could be some sort of mechanical system, it could be the combination of lots of different things. It could be even a legal system. We can talk about that as well. That you get that there is this kind of inevitable result of okay, when these things get so big, you are going to have reduced understanding. And as a result, there's going to be failures, there's going to be bugs, there's going to be a gap between how we think the system actually should operate and how it actually does operate. And we often don't know this until we see the failure. And then we can use that failure to better understand what's actually going on. And we can talk about how bugs can be and failures can be used productively. But it's a very weird sort of mindset that we increasingly need to use when we deal with these complex technologies, which is that it's not always going to be, okay, here's the single point of failure. It's going to be rather, it is the accumulation of a lot of things that lead us to this point of inevitability and incomprehensibility.
I thought about, again, how you were ahead of the curve here with understanding how, and this is a very important term, how code or how jargon, how the law system accretes. So this term accretion is an important one. But ahead of the point of where we are with AI, where the AI is now coding itself. So we know that concept of the ghost in the machine, where the machine will do something that it wasn't even coded for. And nobody exists anymore in the company who wrote that originally line of code. And it's like Frankenstein code, or as it's called, spaghetti code, that accretes over time. And I mentioned this to a guy who works in a long-time veteran in telcos. And he told me, he said, yeah, he remembers at times looking for the guy who wrote the original code. And he's like, anybody know where Bob is? And go, is Bob even still alive? And he's like, Bob's 87, retired 20 years. And they're like, Bob, sorry about this, man. Do you remember that line of code? And inevitably one person will remember it, but that person then passes on, and there's nobody handing that baton from one generation to the next. There's a whole lot of complexity in there that we're not even ready for at this point, where we're going to this jump to now AI writing the code. So there's no even human hands on it anymore. There's a lot in there, Sam, but I think starting with the term accretion, we can build on that and bring back in the point you said there about the legal system.
Yeah, and so accretion is simply just this process of a system kind of growing and pieces being added to it a little bit over and over time. And when we think about complex technologies, that is how they grow. People want to add features, they want to add complexity, they want to handle additional situations. And the truth is, each of those decisions by itself is quite rational. You say, okay, here's the system as it is. We want it to handle this new thing or some new type of software, whatever it is. And then you add some additional feature. And so it slowly but surely accretes over time. The problem is, though, well, one, sometimes you're just putting things as placeholders. So things are like, okay, here's good enough for now. And then, of course, it never gets updated or it never gets modified or fixed. And then suddenly you're just adding more and more on top of it. But then you end up with these systems that are still essential for getting things to work. But right, the people might be long retired, they might be dead. And so this like legacy code, legacy systems where these things that are very old or no longer being updated or no longer being fully understood are still essential for these systems to be run. And right, exactly. When you were talking about those kinds of situations, I was talking to someone who I think he used to work at Los Alamos National Labs, which is kind of like this national lab where they do these large scale computational simulations around like nuclear explosions. And he said he would like occasionally come across chunks of code that would have comments around it saying, do not touch this. No one knows what it does. And it just, that is, I mean, it sounds horrifying and weird, but the truth is that's probably much more the rule rather than the exception, where we just have lots and lots of things that are still necessary for the system to run. And yeah, it's because this slow, steady accretion of functionality and additional features or whatever it is. And then, of course, then you're connecting the system to another system. So the newer thing is still reliant on the older thing. And then, yeah, you get this massive amount of complexity. And then we can talk about this more, but our brains are not designed to handle this kind of thing. But especially with the law, going back to what you were saying about these legal systems, as we add law after law or regulation after regulation, each one might seem completely rational and completely reasonable. But these different rules are all interacting, and they're often interacting in ways that no one who is building this system, whether it's a legal system, whether it's just a more traditional technological system, anticipated. And so, yeah, then you get these massive unanticipated consequences. And yeah, it's like with the legacy stuff that you can see this kind of in the lead up to the Y2K situation where people were not quite sure what was going to happen when the year 2000 rolled around because a lot of computer systems only held 2 digits instead of 4 digits. And so they would think it was actually 1900 instead of the year 2000. A lot of these systems were developed 70s or whatever earlier or a long time ago. And yeah, and they had to often bring people out of retirement and say, okay, like help us figure out these things because no one was around who had actually built those systems any longer.
I thought we'd mention why that's important. And there's a piece I pulled from the book here that we might miss this, that we're at this point where it's a digital economy and so much of our infrastructure is dependent on code or on a digital economy. And you said the relationship between our human-made systems and the natural world means that each of our actions now has even more unexpected ramifications than ever before, rippling not just to every corner of our infrastructure, but to every corner of the planet and sometimes even beyond. The totality of our technology and infrastructure is becoming the equivalent of an enormously complicated vascular system, both physical and digital, that pulls in the Earth's raw materials and emits roads, skyscrapers, large populations, and chemical effluent. Our technological realm has accelerated the metabolism of the Earth and done so in an extraordinarily complicated dance of materials, even changing the glow of the planet's surface. Absolutely love that. But there's a really important point there. And I think this is a point that we miss because we're so busy and we have a shifting baseline of technology that we just become accustomed to. And we're on to the next one then all of a sudden, including the race to AI. I thought you might share some thoughts on that.
I think many of us have this sense that like there's us, there's humans, or there's nature, and then there's technology. And the truth is, first of all, throughout history, humans have always been affecting our environment and the world around us. But at this point, increasingly, we are in this weird sort of like co-evolutionary situation where we have modified the world itself at this point is this massive technological system. And so the writer Kevin Kelly, he talks about the technium, the entire ecosystem of technology. And we are embedded within that. And of course, what that means is when this thing is massively, massively complex, that we're in it, but we don't necessarily fully understand it. And so the computer scientist Danny Hillis talked about this idea that we've moved from the Enlightenment when we thought we could apply our rationality to the world around us to understand it. And of course, that still pays a lot of dividends and we should not discount that. But we've moved increasingly to what he refers to as the entanglement, where everything is so hopelessly interconnected that we can no longer fully understand it. And right, when you think about these socio-technical systems, both our infrastructure, our software, the code that runs all these different kinds of things, logistical systems we were talking, you mentioned before with the pandemic, all these things are it's this massively complicated vascular system that really is a technology. It is this massive technology. No one person has built this entire thing. It's emerged in this very distributed kind of way. But now we are forced to contend with it and really try to understand it. And in many ways, we have to look to it in the same way that biologists try to understand ecosystems. We now have to understand our technological ecosystem in order to really understand how these things actually work, or sometimes increasingly don't work fully.
You delve a little bit into complexity, the science of complexity. And I thought it was important. Not everybody understands the difference between complicated and complex. And you do give it a bit of time in the book as well. But you use them interchangeably, but they have different meanings. And you mentioned that kind of Gordian knot of the entanglement. I think it's worth explaining that so everybody's on the same page as we progress.
And to be clear, I think different people might distinguish between complicated and complex in different sorts of ways. And certainly in the book, I do often use them interchangeably, especially also just due to the fact, like, if I use the exact same word over and over, it would be very annoying to read. So I have to have a little bit of synonyms. But I do want to distinguish between, right, in terms of complication versus complexity. Like when something is complicated, it might have a lot of interconnected parts. And so I discuss it in the context between, I think I use the example of a whole bunch of buoys in the water that are all interconnected. And so you take all the buoys and there's like a whole bunch of ropes, you throw them on the dock or on the pier or whatever. And the interrelationships is very complicated. Like trying to see, okay, how this one is connected to this other one. It requires a lot of explanation and like description to understand what that is. But that system is static. It doesn't have sophisticated behavior. It just has this very convoluted structure. When a system is complex, not only does it have a lot of parts, but due to the interactions of those parts, it yields a whole set of behaviors that require sort of a different mode of thinking to understand. So like if you took all those buoys with all those different connections and then threw them in the water, and then now with waves and things like that, you now suddenly have feedback. You might have some sort of weird emergent behavior where they all move together in a way that you couldn't fully anticipate. And so those kinds of like nonlinear feedback and emergence and maybe some sort of concerted behavior, it's the behavior coupled with the interactions and the connections that is the sort of the kind of complexity and complex things that I'm talking about here. And of course, all these systems that we were talking about so far, they're not just complicated in terms of, oh, like this is a really hard thing to keep in my mind. They are also very complex, because not only do I need to keep the bits and pieces in my mind, I need to understand how they all interact, and then how those interactions yield other interactions. Then, of course, you have the second order thinking and third order thinking, and it becomes this weird, nonlinear, highly complex process and behavior.
There's a book I'm reading as well. I can't see it here. I thought I had it. It's called Human Errors by Nathan Lentz. And it's about all these errors we have in our genome, and as humans, having a tailbone that's no longer needed anymore. And you do touch on this later on, that just as nature has that, as we have junk DNA that we think is junk, we don't know actually quite what it does. It could be very valuable that we don't know what it does at all. That this happens in code as well, which I thought was remarkable, that somebody might go, you can't remove that line of code. You might be trying to clean up the spaghetti code, but it does something and it will have a knock-on effect like the buoy. That's really important to understand, because people go, well, why don't we just start from scratch? And you're like, it's not that easy.
Yeah, and so this is this idea of like the kludge, which is like this thing, like you build a system, it works, but oftentimes you're building in certain parts in a way that are not always the cleanest, or where like things work, but as you try to actually interrogate the system, you realize that these things that you think maybe are not as relevant are actually incredibly vital for the system to operate. And so, yeah, and especially within software, going back to like this accretion process, like these things that you might think are old or no longer relevant are actually still vital for the system to operate, even if you don't necessarily fully understand them. And right, and like in terms of like evolution, right, we have many things in our evolutionary history. We look at ourselves like we are the accumulation of many things that maybe are no longer quite relevant, but are still there. They might be relevant, they might not be, but we have to recognize that kind of thing. And so I think I mentioned the example in the book of where we used to live, in the backyard, there were these trees that had these giant spikes on them, basically. Like they were kind of frightening.
Honey locust.
I think it was the honey locust tree. Yeah. And the honey locust tree. And so it turns out I was doing a little digging into why there are these spikes. And biologists think that the reason they're there was to actually prevent the giant megafauna of North America from eating the leaves or eating the fruit or whatever of the tree, or eating the bark. Maybe, I don't know what it was. But of course, these giant megafauna, like these like massive sloths or whatever, like they've been extinct for tens of thousands of years. But evolution takes time. And so these trees haven't gotten the message. So that kind of thing is still part of the genetic information of the tree, even though it's no longer relevant. And of course, you see this kind of thing with code and technology more broadly, where it's just like these things accumulate. They're maybe not relevant, maybe they are, we don't really know. Yeah, and of course, going with like junk DNA, we now realize that like a lot of that is not actually junk. But these systems, they have all these kind of accumulations of things, bits and pieces. There's been optimization processes that we're not fully clear on. And as a result, you end up with these things, you don't fully understand them. They kludgy, they kind of work, we don't really know. And this is actually one of the other features of a lot of these technologies. We've talked about accretion and interconnection. One of the other forces that kind of causes these systems to become very complex is the idea of contending with edge cases and kind of the weirdness of the world itself. The evolutionary process within biology will add bits and pieces to handle, this situation or this other exception or this other kind of thing. It will not necessarily result in something beautiful or pristine or clean or optimized, or we'll say it might be optimized, but it might not necessarily be a kind of like a simple, elegant kind of result, but it works. It gets the job done. And the same kind of thing happens in technology, where especially when you're dealing with the messiness of the real world, especially the messiness of the human-made real world, you have to contend with all these edge cases. And as a result, you end up with a very complex system. And so I give the example of like building a calendar application, where like you would think, it's like very easy. Like I'm going to build a calendar app. It's going to have like 365 days in a year, done. And of course, that's not quite true. To actually handle our current Gregorian calendar, you have to realize, not only are there leap years, which are not every 4 years, they're actually like, it's every 4 years, unless it's every 100 years, which is also not divisible by every 400 years. Then you have to, which is like a weird kind of algorithm you have to include. Then you have to deal with maybe time changes and the weirdness of time zones and all these other kind of things. And then suddenly you end up with this massively complex piece of software because it's dealing with all of these weird, messy edge cases of reality. And to solve it, you would think, maybe I can make some like very clear algorithm. But no, you often have to just put lots of like weird if statements and other kinds of things. And it gets all very, very complex and hard to understand as well.
I love that when you talked about the edge cases. I heard one which was incredible, which was self-driving cars, that once the self-driving car didn't know what to do because a truck went past full of traffic lights. And squirting from one place to the next, and the car was like going, it does not compute to explode. It didn't.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And then like finding these edge cases and these things, right, they're often super interesting. I feel like with a lot of AI, like the current AI systems, and like, the interesting thing is with the book Overcomplicated, so it came out in 2016, before the current big wave of complex LLMs. But increasingly, the way we begin to understand these LLMs is by finding, these weird edge cases and exceptions to understand, like how are these things actually doing what they're doing? How are they actually processing information? And we'll discuss this next week, but like the Magic of Code actually discusses a lot of these things around edge cases and glitches and using these as windows to understand our systems much more. But oftentimes, right, you have to handle the edge cases, but then you also increasingly realize that oftentimes you have not handled all the edge cases, but you don't realize this until yet another edge case comes to the fore and you're like, oh my God, I hadn't realized this. And I believe I discussed this idea. It's a term from physics, this idea of a system that is robust yet fragile. And the idea behind this, and maybe I'm using the term a little bit more metaphorically, but when a system is robust yet fragile, it means that it's robust to all the things that we anticipate it being able to handle, but incredibly fragile to basically anything outside of that distribution, outside of any of the things that we've built the system to handle. And the problem is, though, is we often don't realize that a system is robust yet fragile until we are confronted with that fragility, until some bug creates some sort of catastrophic cascade or whatever it is. And of course, we see these things more and more with where it's some weird buggy version of Windows or some weird update like causes weird cascade, and suddenly all the airlines have gone down for like several hours. And we see these kinds of things like they happen not infrequently. And it's very humbling.
That intellectual humility is the common thread I see through the three books, in that that's where it starts from. And then you just bring it into different realms. So you bring it from actual facts and knowledge into the digital realm, and then you go into the code realm next, which we'll talk about next week, which is nice. And it's great. That's why I love doing these series like this back to back, because it's a privilege to get an author like this to do it, but also to see the progression of their thinking over time, which is really nice. But there was a couple of things. When you talked about the complexity, the buoys tied together, I thought about, well, that's really important to understand. You said, for example, a piece of code goes down over here. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but then something over here doesn't work. You talked about Gmail, for example, happened Gmail, and they were like, oh, what the heck's happening here? And it was connected to some cloud that somebody coded it for that shouldn't have been to. So there's all this kludgy code or spaghetti code in there, and those people move on, maybe hired somewhere else, etc. But then there's the world where you build upon that. So you go, the world opening up APIs, the interoperability of code seems like a great thing, which it is. It needs to be accessible so it can connect to everything else. But there's a huge cost there, and there's a trade-off with cost and failure. And again, these are things we don't really stop to think about, and why I like the book is that it's stuff that you just wouldn't think of. And as you said, until it happens, and we don't actually foresee this, we don't scenario plan, we don't red team, we don't chaos monkey like Netflix would do. So maybe we'll talk about the interoperability and that trade-off.
This is one of those things where, on the one hand, building systems that are interoperable, that sounds like an unalloyed good. Like you want this kind of thing. You want systems to be able to pass information and update in certain ways. And that's great. But of course, it does come with trade-offs, as you mentioned, which is that when one system maybe does something wrong, or one system is updated in a way that the other system can't anticipate, you can have things that then cascade through a system and cause failures that you might not have recognized. Like interoperability, right? These kinds of things always come with trade-offs, and that's fine. And I think for me, like going back to intellectual humility, it's more just a matter of recognizing that when we build our system, we have to recognize that it's going to come with trade-offs. Like these systems might be more sophisticated, but also as a result, they might be more conducive to failure. And you mentioned like the Chaos Monkey system within Netflix, the way it operates is actually trying to reduce the amount of unexpectedness and lack of understanding there. Because oftentimes when these systems go down, you're not going to fully understand the entire shape of the system. So really, the best way to sometimes understand how these systems actually should operate is to, in this case, almost like inject bugs, inject failures into the system. And so the way the Chaos Monkey system within Netflix works is it periodically just will randomly take down different subsystems to make sure that when there is some unexpected failure, the system is as robust as possible. So the engineers are able to actually build in a certain amount of resilience and robustness. But when we have this kind of interoperability, it also highlights two interesting things. One is the fact that sometimes, going back to what we were saying earlier, the reason for failure is not a person. It's not, someone did something wrong. It's more these two things, which on their own can behave perfectly fine. When they interact, there are going to be unexpected consequences. And so maybe you could say, then it's the fault of the person who created the interconnection. And of course, I'm sure you can always place blame, but we also have to recognize that to a certain degree, These are systemic kind of failures. They're not just like individual choices that are causing these failures. The other aspect of these systems, and in terms of like the interoperability, is actually also related to somewhat how we think about open source software. And I discuss this a little bit more in my next book as well. But oftentimes we think, oh, like you're building on open source software. A lot of people have been looking at it. It should be really well understood. And sometimes that is true. But many times systems that we think are really well understood, they're actually integral for lots of other systems, like the piece of open source software. But it might not be maintained by, I don't know, thousands of people. It's maintained by one guy who doesn't have enough time to handle these kinds of things, or he built it and then moved on to something else. But it's still essential for a lot of these other systems. And we see this where there was, what was it, the Heartbleed bug? I think that might have been the one that I mentioned, where it was one of these failures where it turned out it was like something related to the internet infrastructure. And it was like, yeah, this one little bit of code or this piece of software that was essential for all these different things. And it was like this one guy built it a long time ago and it propagated. And for me, actually, one of the takeaways there, I think, is to also just realize that we need to really just invest more into like maintenance and support for these kinds of things if they are essential and if they are being used by all these different systems, and like then we should really actually maintain them in a way that kind of befits them. And like all the companies that maybe use these kinds of things should actually pay it forward, actually, in this case, pay it back, like actually allow these systems to be maintained properly. But overall, I would just say the interoperability kind of goes hand in hand with this intellectual humility of like, yeah, when these things interconnect, our understanding is going to be reduced. It doesn't necessarily therefore mean that we don't understand it entirely or at all. And we can talk about this more about understanding is really this kind of like spectrum. It's not like an either like full understanding or nothing. But we have to recognize that as these systems become more interoperable or just increasing in size and are built over time, our understanding is going to be reduced. And that's fine. We just need to confront that with open eyes.
And it brings us then, you teed us up earlier on to the idea of the biological limits of human comprehension. So whether we like to admit that or not, it is very true. We have limits. And one of the things that's been bugging me like a buzzing fridge is the idea that it's going to get worse the more we outsource to the machine. So digital dementia, where we do more and more of our thinking. If you get ChatGPT to write for you and you're not going through the struggle of the writing, you're not using that muscle atrophies, that brain atrophies, etc. But you say, as our systems become more complex over time, a gap begins to grow between the structure of these complex systems and what our brains can handle. Whether it's the entirety of the internet or other large pieces of infrastructure, understanding the whole is no longer even close to possible. And hand in hand with this becomes what happened post-industrial revolution of our drive towards specialization and the lack thereof of T workers or generalists.
Yeah. And so starting with kind of like the biological limits of like our ability to understand, right? These systems, the way we build these systems is based on, right, a huge number of interconnected parts. They're all doing things. There's feedback. There's nonlinear phenomena. These are not things that we evolved to think about. And the truth is, very quickly, our brains break down. And I think I actually even discussed a whole bunch of different examples of the things our brains are good at, the things that computers can handle. And so, yeah, and there's like a classic paper looking at like how many bits of information we can hold in our short-term memory. And it's not hundreds or thousands, which of course is still much smaller than these systems. It's 7, like plus or minus 2. And so like that shows we are very limited. The speed of our neurons is not particularly fast. There's different estimates about like how much we can actually hold in our long-term memory. So that actually might be reasonably powerful, but especially if you look at being able to hold, like I was mentioning before, like these like nonlinear feedback kinds of things. Like these are things where systems are feeding back on themselves. There's all that's related to this idea of like recursion, where something is calling itself and building things more and more complicated. Recursion also occurs in language, where you can say like, I thought, that she thought, that he thought, that I thought, like about this or whatever it is. And of course, you can't do that more than a few times before your kind of brain breaks down in terms of trying to understand a sentence like that. A computer should have no issue with actually parsing that kind of sentence. And so you can see that once you have multiple different layers of feedback, our brains are not good at that. But these systems can keep on doing these kinds of things. And I think there needs to be a recognition, right, that we are building these systems in a way that we are not particularly good at understanding. Now the question becomes, what do we do with that? Like, how do we still try to understand these systems? And this kind of goes to what we were talking in terms of understanding. Like, understanding is not a binary condition. It's not, okay, I either understand this thing with perfect fidelity and understanding every aspect of it, or I'm living in complete and total utter ignorance. You can be somewhere in between. And in fact, most of our lives of understanding things, that's where we are. And I think trying to figure out how we can move closer to the more complete understanding and away from the complete utter ignorance is the key. And so whether or not it's like saying, okay, I can understand how this module connects to this other piece, or I can understand the broader shape of what's going on, that can be helpful. Going back to where you were talking about with AI, of like, on the one hand, you're right, it's like reducing our understanding of these kinds of things, and maybe we're no longer thinking about them. That being said, I do think, going back to trade-offs, if we say to ourselves, okay, we will never understand these systems, but can I use tools to better understand the underlying technology? So it's one of these weird things where on the one hand, I don't understand this technology, but then I'm going to use another technology to actually understand the original technology. And that also comes with trade-offs, because maybe you'll get an incomplete understanding. Maybe the technology you're using as a tool, sort of this like technological microscope itself, you might not fully understand. And so there's always going to be trade-offs. But I do think we can sometimes use these tools, these additional technologies, to move us a little bit closer to more complete understanding. We might not ever get there, but we can do these kinds of things. And so one of the examples I give, this is like well before or current era of AI, was I think Google wanted to better understand the energy efficiency of their data centers. And they used, is then probably reasonably complex machine learning, probably now is like extremely rudimentary. But they recognized that they were using this technique to actually understand the systems that they themselves could not fully and completely understand. And that's fine. And I think that can actually be very useful. Oftentimes, though, when we build these systems or build a mental model for these things, it's going to be a simplification of their overall system. The question becomes, how useful is that model? Which is actually one of the things I also discussed in the Magic of Code, about like thinking about complexity and managing complexity. But yeah, this is one of those things where I think we have to recognize that like, the technology we already have, like it's not like, oh, we're increasingly going to get to the point where we're not going to understand these technologies and we have to grapple with that fact. We have been there for a long time. The problem, though, is for many of us, especially if you're not dealing with these systems on a daily basis, you've been shielded from that level of complexity. And I don't think I included this in Overcomplicated, but it was around the time when the Apple Watch first came out. There was this article it was in the Wall Street Journal, I think like the style section, talking about, okay, are people still going to buy mechanical watches? Is everyone just going to start buying smartwatches? And they interviewed this one guy who was a big fan of mechanical watches. And of course, people are still buying them. And he said, yeah, of course I want a mechanical watch. Like, when I think about a mechanical watch and all of its sophistication, it's so wonderful, as opposed to the smartwatch, which is just a chip. Now, like, I will not deny that a mechanical watch is sophisticated, but like a smartwatch is like, it's orders of magnitude more complex than a mechanical watch. But for many people, they're shielded from that level of complexity. So one of the things that I actually try to argue for is like finding ways to peek under the hood, to actually kind of reveal a little bit of that complexity. Because increasingly, we are being shielded from these kinds of things. Like, you look at like an iPad, which is just like, I don't even know how the files are stored, versus you look at like early computers. Like, my family's first computer was the Commodore VIC-20, connected to your television, use these like cassette tapes to store information. And the way you got computer programs is like, oftentimes you just enter the code in yourself. And I have vague memories of my father doing this kind of thing. And you could see the clear relationship between the code being entered, like the text being entered, and what was happening on the screen. Sometimes resulting in a game or something cool, more often than not, some weird buggy thing or whatever. And you could see that clear relationship. And I think for many of us, though, we've been shielded from that kind of thing. And so one of the things I argue is like finding ways to at least reveal a tiny bit of that complexity. Because otherwise, we're going to think, oh, this thing is actually really simple, until some failure or some cascading catastrophic issue. And then we're confronted with the fact that, oh no, these systems are actually much more complex than we might have realized.
I often think about that even as a reality thing, that, you know, what we see, colors and all that, it's just an interpretation by the lens we have. And you mentioned it as well, and I went down a rabbit hole of looking at how technology actually bolsters our level of understanding. But one of the things I found in the history was we went from having just two cones to trichromacy. So we now were able to observe more colors. But I often think about that. The way we perceive things is essentially like the desktop on a computer versus the MS-DOS screen writing. It's just all these ones and zeros
Right.
on the screen, etc. But we'll move on for that. But the point I wanted to just lean on there was that term abstraction, which is I just assume that in a way so I can just actually get on with it, that I can level up my understanding. But I mentioned this, that it became even more apparent to me after our last conversation and today, was that the importance of using the technology to actually level up because of that limited, the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. Because we have a limit in our understanding, we can actually use the technology to get above that, so we don't have to hold all that in working memory, and we can then make connections and patterns at a different level that we couldn't make before. And I think that's what technology can do for us if we use it for that. But one of the problems I have, and I don't know if you've had this, and it's why I have that library behind me, and probably why you have it, is the burden of knowledge. And the burden of knowledge is a real thing where, say, for example, your new book came out, right? So I was like, I cannot interview him on his new book until I've read his previous books to see where he's coming from, right? So I have it on the level of this show. And that's why I cover older books, and people are like, oh, why are you covering that book? And I'm like, well, I kind of need to understand where that theory came from. And if the person's still with us, if they're still alive, definitely getting them on the show to be able to bring those two things together and to record that knowledge. So you don't even have to read the book anymore, and you can maybe fast track the burden of knowledge for yourself. There's a lot in there, but I thought that burden of knowledge thing is important to understand, and how then tech can help us get over that.
Yeah, so this idea of the burden of knowledge is, right, like in order to, and actually going back to the scientific kind of stuff that we discussed last week about the half-life of facts, is like oftentimes, like in order to make discoveries at the frontier, you have to learn everything up until that point. There are things that have become obsolete, or I'm going back to the half-life of facts. Like, you don't necessarily have to learn like the cutting-edge alchemy in order to make chemistry discoveries, but you have to learn a whole bunch, and which means that it takes a long time and a lot of training to really get to that frontier. And especially in science, as we learn more and more and our body of scientific knowledge increases, that creates an increased burden to actually learn all these different kinds of things. And also in terms of our technologies, like how we build these technologies also requires a huge amount of understanding, especially as these technologies get more and more complex. You have to understand the bits and pieces of different things, and certainly a framework that was used in some piece of software or whatever it was. And abstraction can help with that kind of thing, where you can say, okay, here's the thing as it is. I've abstracted away the details, and I don't necessarily have to worry about everything that kind of came before it. The problem, though, is sometimes when abstraction layers break down and you actually are forced to confront all of those kind of those pieces as well. And so the burden of knowledge, whether you're thinking about technological advancement or scientific advancement, it is this increasingly pressing thing where it is harder and harder to create new knowledge, create new technologies, whatever, because you're often required to learn more and more to get there at that frontier. There are ways of sidestepping and going back to like this abstraction, but it is a really big issue. And then, of course, it goes hand in hand with, okay, there's this increasing amount of knowledge that's required, increasing amount of understanding, but our brains are finite. Like, it's not like one of these things where, okay, I can spend 100 years understanding this kind of thing, or I can absorb millions of pages of things. Like, you can't do that. Like, either you don't have enough time, you don't have enough mental capacity. It's just not possible. And so, then it becomes, how can I use tools, increasingly computational tools and technologies, to help me grapple with the burden of knowledge, whether it's increasingly complex technology or one that has lots of different pieces together, whether it's scientific knowledge and grappling with different bits and pieces from different subfields or entirely different fields to make new discoveries. You need tools to help you better understand these kinds of things. But as a result, in the same way that I want to peek under the hood, but sometimes we feel like we're increasingly distant from our technologies, you sometimes you're using these kinds of things in a way that's mediated by these assistive tools as opposed to getting into the nitty gritty. So there's always going to be these sorts of trade-offs, and we just need to be open about it.
I mentioned there the specialization, and you touched on this, the idea of being a generalist, that you have so much knowledge, but actually when you mentioned, for example, the Apple Watch just being it's just a chip. Well, it made me think of what you said about the autonomous, or not even autonomous vehicle, but an electric car, that it takes so many different disciplines, different specialists to come together and coordinate, and neurodiversity to see that same challenge from different angles with different specialties to bring it together in order to develop that type of thing. But oftentimes then to think about that is very difficult when you bring people, and they're all seeing it from their own perspective the whole time, their own specialization. But then the generalist, as you said, is aware of all those different disciplines, but also then able to zoom up above them and see the common denominators, the overlaps, the Venn diagrams between all these different things. But that is not very valued, but extremely valuable in today's society. I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but I thought it's an important thing because I know many of our listeners would be in that bucket and would appreciate the shows. And it's why I try and draw from different elements. But there's common denominators in all this stuff that is important for innovation or change or transformation.
And going back to a burden of knowledge, like as you require huge amounts of specialists to deal with these systems, you require lots of expertise and it requires a lot of effort. The interesting thing about these complex technologies is exactly what you're saying. They often draw on many, many different areas of expertise. And so there's huge amounts of specialization involved, which means by and large, no single expert can handle all of these different things. And so then the question becomes, well, can we actually gain a better sense of understanding of these technologies? And the key is someone who has a more generalist kind of thinking. Sometimes people call these like T-shaped individuals, where they might have a series of expertise in one area, but that's the vertical part of the T, and then the horizontal part of the T allows you to jump across lots of different domains. And whether that's being able to more easily translate different types of jargon, understanding exactly what you were saying before, of kind of like mental models that can be useful for multiple different domains. I actually do think increasingly, as our technologies become interdisciplinary in the different domains that they touch on, we need these kinds of generalist thinkers or these kinds of T-shaped individuals. The problem, though, is how do we create them? How do we support them? How do we kind of valorize them in today's society, where I think expertise is often very, very valued, not to the detriment of generalists, but it's very, very hard sometimes to figure out how to cultivate them. And David Epstein had a wonderful book, Range, where he tried to actually talk about the value and the power of people with more generalist thinking and how to get these people, build them, and stick them in the world, because I think we need more of them. But especially when it comes to building these technologies, we need more of them. And actually, one of the things I discuss is, I remember my mother told me about when she was in, was it the Girl Scouts? There were these different badges you could get. You could, get a badge for learning how to go camping, or who knows, all these different. But then there was one badge called the Dabbler badge. And it was getting, just doing a little bit of lots of different things. And she told me that she earned the Dabbler badge. And it was and I love the fact that there was this reward, or there was this recognition of knowing a little bit about lots of different things is actually valuable. That in itself is something that we need to actually value and recognize. And I think increasingly as a society, we have to recognize we need more of these dabblers. We need people who are we need Dabbler badges for these kinds of things, because those are the kind of generalists who they will need to work in conjunction with experts. It's not an either or. It's not just, we only need experts or we only need generalists. But we have to recognize that cultivating generalists, as well as actually incorporating them into our organizations, is very, very valuable. Because oftentimes, when you have an organization that is just full of experts, they're dealing with their very specific thing, and there's no one then in that organization that has the luxury or the mandate to say, let's take a little step backward. Let's figure out how these things interconnect, or sometimes fail to interconnect. Or are there other ideas that we should be exploring? Are there ideas that we can use in this import-export business of knowledge that we can bring to bear? And so we need to find ways to actually recognize, that this is a very valuable part of knowledge creation, of managing complex technologies, as opposed to just saying either there's going to be people who know everything, or there's going to be people who are experts in some very specific thing. We need to build people who have not knowing everything, because then it's a dilettante, because then they really actually don't have any deep expertise. So I think that T-shaped individual where you actually do have an expertise, but you are also very comfortable jumping into lots of different domains and then providing that sort of connective tissue to different experts. That is something that we really need more.
And just a note to our audience, David Epstein will be on the show next year. We're going to be doing a version of the Sam episode with him covering his books, The Sports Genes and Range. And I think he might be working on a new one in the meantime, just like you did, Sam, as well. I have to code in for an extra week there. It's like the Y2K code. I'll have to make space for an extra book for people. But I was intrigued and I absolutely loved what you talked about, the difference between physics thinking and biological thinking. I absolutely love this. And the contrast of those and the mirror of those with innovation. In innovation literature, we talk about the need for exploration and exploitation. Much like you said, the Girl Guides, that type of roaming and exploring versus being a soldier and very focused on a certain challenge. But that difference is beautiful, and I'd love you to take us through it.
Yeah, so I'm sure there are going to be many physicists and biologists that will just view this as an oversimplification. But the way to think about this kind of thing is oftentimes the physics mode of thinking, whether or not it's always physicists doing this kind of thing, but the physics mode of thinking involves, and going back to abstraction, abstracting away the details, saying, okay, this system is very complex, but I can ignore certain details and try to see, okay, here are the broad shape of what's going on. And that kind of thing is really, really powerful to say, okay, like looking at the world and saying, okay, throwing a ball, the way the moon orbits the earth, the way the tides work, like these things are all like wildly different, but it turns out we can abstract away the details and say they're actually all being involved. Like there's gravity. Gravity is the thing that kind of understands the parabolic arc of a baseball and trying to help us explain the tides, help us explain the orbits of the planets or the orbit of the moon or whatever it is. And this is incredibly powerful. That kind of like Newtonian approach of saying, okay, here's all these widely disparate phenomena. Let's actually try to understand them in some sort of unifying way, this kind of unifying approach that ignores certain details. And I would say that's like the physics mode of thinking. The biological mode of thinking is saying, no, in fact, sometimes we need to like revel in all the details, because the details are actually really, really important to understand. Okay, what is like the specific evolutionary history for how we got to where we are and why this thing does this in biology. And of course, you can see both. I would say the biological mode of thinking in physics maybe is like where people were just trying to like collect lots and lots of different particles when they're like understanding particle physics. That would be a more biological mode in physics. And conversely, a physics mode in biology would be like Darwin and saying, okay, actually evolution explains a whole host of disparate things that we actually see. That being said, this kind of like the detail-oriented mode, which is more akin to collecting lots of different bits of information and then slowly but surely building up a complete picture of what's going on, that works really, really well when you have a really sophisticated system where the details actually matter. And increasingly, those are our technologies. We think, okay, our technologies, they're human-made, they're going to be entirely rational. And yeah, sometimes they are. But when you have a really complex technology that has an almost organic level of complexity, it's evolved over time, we have legacy code, like we're actually using biological terms. And at that point, it becomes, oh, maybe we should actually use the techniques of biological thinking, or even the way in which biologists interrogate complex biological systems to actually interrogate complex technologies. And often when I give a talk about overcomplicated and complex technologies, I'll show this massively complex chart that looks like a circuit diagram. And it turns out it is a diagram of the metabolic processes within a cell. So it is a biological system, but it looks like a complex technology. And of course, conversely, complex technologies are increasingly looking like biology. And you see this actually with a lot of AI systems where we understand the general principles of how these systems are trained, but the result is incredibly complex. And then it requires interrogating them using almost like biological, like field biology kind of principles of weird exceptions, why these things do these weird situations, trying to slowly but surely build up a picture of why these LLMs or other AI systems are doing what they're doing. because oftentimes that is going to be much more valuable than saying, oh, like I'll just abstract away the details. This is how it works, because that's not how it works. In biological systems, or at least using the biological mode of thinking, abstracting away the details misses so much of the system's behavior that you can't actually afford to ignore those kinds of details.
I have a lovely quote, Sam, right at the end of the book that I'd love to share. And before I share that as our final message, I'd love you to think about your final message. And I hope this might tee you up, actually. It's beautifully written. You said, there is a whimsy and beauty in the complicated and the unexpected. A glittering and shimmering technological network with its branching gossamer web of links and interactions is unbelievable in its complexity. And sometimes, even if we don't understand every part and every whole, an imperfect grasp can be enough. We can walk humbly with our technology. I love that. That was the end of chapter 5, but I just thought it was a nice finale and beautifully written. But over to you, maybe as your final message for this part 2 on Overcomplicated.
Yeah, thank you. I think this message of humility is one of the things that I think a lot about, whether it's understanding our science or technologies, that oftentimes, like going back to what I was saying, we're not going to have complete ignorance. We're also not going to have complete understanding. Our understanding is going to be somewhere in between. But oftentimes, when we are confronted with technologies we don't fully understand, we often zoom to two extremes. One of fear in the face of the unknown, or awe in the face of this thing is like so unbelievably complex, it's almost like the mind of God. And of course, like, it's not the mind of God. It's like the mind of, I don't know, Google or like some other thing that's built by imperfect people. And in the fear in the face of the unknown, yeah, these systems can be complex, but oftentimes both fear as well as awe, like this kind of undue reverence, they cut off questioning and any sort of attempt to fully or further understand the system, what's going on. We might never fully understand it, but we need to actually keep on trying. And so for me, that kind of productive middle ground is humility, which is saying, okay, I might not ever fully understand these things. And that's okay. And actually, I talk about how in the era before the Enlightenment, certainly in the Middle Ages, there was this understanding of like, oh yeah, there are certain things that humans might never fully understand. And of course, with the advent of the Enlightenment, we set that aside. And I think that is good, that we should actually keep on trying to understand our technologies, aspects of the world. These things are very, very important. But we still might need to recognize that, yeah, there's going to be limits. Humans are incredibly finite creatures. And so we should keep on trying to understand things, but also recognize that it's okay if we don't fully understand it in all of its details. And so for me, as long as we have this productive humility of never stop trying to actually further understand our technologies or the systems we built or aspects of the world around us, but also recognize that we are going to be finite, and so we might need to grapple with that kind of thing, then I think we are going to be much better positioned to actually engage with the true complexity of the world around us, as opposed to saying like, oh no, this is something we can never fully understand, or actually sometimes thinking it's actually a lot simpler than it truly is. And so as long as we can maintain that productive humility in the face of even the technologies we ourselves have built, I think we will be able to build them better, as well as try to actually understand them more and more productively.
And Sam, for people who want to find you, your Substack, your books, etc., where's the best place?
Yeah, so the best place, if you go to my website, arbesman.net, that will have links to my Substack, as well as a lot of my writing in my books. And that's probably the best way to reach me.
Author of Overcomplicated, Samuel Arbesman. And don't forget, up next, Magic of Code next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Find out more about Kyndryl at kyndryl, Kyndryl.com.